What's up? How are you guys? I am making myself a note. Here's why. Because I am excited that we're doing communion, and I will forget. And so I'm making a note. My sermon ends with communion in all bold letters. Okay, so I've noticed something. And let me just tell you where I feel like that we've been. And if you've caught the podcast this week, let me catch you up on what's going on. I feel like God has had Lacey and I in a season of silence. And I don't mean silence like we're not calling people back or being rude or anything like that. But one of the things that I feel called to as a leader is constantly forecasting. I try to keep a pulse on where I feel like God's taking us. And here's what I don't want to ever do. I don't want to ever stand up in front of people and go, here's what I think God's doing. But then behind the scenes, I'm like, and I feel like this week, the floodgates kind of opened a little bit, and I'm excited about the next season. I'm excited about where we're going, and I'm going to tell you this. I know. Now you're going to go, well, this isn't me. I'm not saying this is you, but I am saying this. I feel called to people that are not being reached by a traditional church approach. That's where my heartbeat is. And if you go, well, that's not really me. It doesn't mean I don't love you or I'm not happy that you're here. I'm excited that you're here. If you're listening online, it's not like we're excluding church people. I'm just so confident that what we've been called to is something that is so specific and so unique that someone could walk in and go, I know that I'm not a church person, and I know that I can kind of hang out here and just observe what's going on. And so if it ever feels like the way that we do things is like, what are they doing? It may not be to target you. It might be a good place for you. Like, it might be a good place for you to sort of find yourself at home. But this might be one of those places where you're like, well, I'm tempted. I get more nervous in the service that's recorded because there's proof of what I said. I can't just, bleh. So there's 22 people. I just looked before I came up here. There are 22 people that have shared the service on Facebook this morning. And I'm looking around, and if everybody just in this room had shared it, it would be almost double that. That's on me. Here's why that's on me. Because I know there's been this gathering, and here's what happens is when you're going and everybody knows where you're going, everybody sort of gets tighter. Have you ever been in a line and everybody's moving, it kind of gets tighter, and it feels like over the last couple months, it's kind of been like, God. And listen, if you've never been in leadership, you got to know this, that when you're like, God, people are like, Jordan, give me a minute. I want to encourage you to share, and here's why. What we're going to discuss today is the most important sermon I've ever preached, and I mean it. I believe it. I believe what we're about to say is going to be the defining, pivotal course of Shiloh moving forward. I really do believe that. So here's my point. If you'll take your phone out of your pocket, and if you'll share it to your Facebook page right now, I will promise you I'm not going to embarrass you, and I won't disappoint you. Is that fair? Is it fair that we've been kind of waiting for clarity? Do it. Do it right now. If you're watching online, share it online. Here's why. Because I want everybody within the sound of who this reaches to know where we're going, how I believe we're going to get there, and what we're going to accomplish, why it's worth it, why it's important, and why I've been so flippin' miserable to be around for the last 3 months. I threw that last part in. Share it again. If you've already shared it once, share it again. There are times that I know I'm preaching to the margins. There are times I'll stand up and I'll get ready to preach, and I know, man, I'm going to be doing really good if 1 out of every 10 people, if this hits. If I were to stand up and talk about, the recovering from divorce, I already know there's going to be people like, oh, I've never been through a divorce, check out. Or if I'm like, hey, struggling with finances, somebody's like, oh, my finances are good, check out. I know there are times I'm preaching to the margins. This is one of the few days that I get where I can say every single person that hears what I'm about to say, this sermon has a residence in your spirit if you'll allow it. Now, I've said that I feel called to reach people that are not being reached by a traditional church model. That's where, that's my heartbeat. I think that's actually your heartbeat too, and I think that's probably why you're here. I think we share that. Here's what I love about it, is if I go, hey, do this, I expect that the average person would go, no. I respect that. I don't want somebody that listens and does what I say based on the fact that I said it. It's a challenge that we have to go, then can I present it in a way? He hates it when I mention him, but one of my favorite interactions is with Jason Graham, because when I call Jason Graham, he doesn't answer. I can see it in my mind. He'll look at his phone and he'll be like, nope. And we're friends. Nope. He might text back if I'm lucky, what? Every time my phone doesn't get answered when I call Jason, there's a little like, classic Jason. I don't expect that my friends have to do things in a certain manner. That's the joy of freedom. But it also leaves the door wide open. People can come in, people can go out. It's going to be a little bit of a different approach. This one specifically, I know for a fact that if someone could consider it, there's a place, you're like, man, this is a long lead up. Are we going to get started? I hope so. Romans 8, 5 and 6. Paul writes this, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds according to the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. Now listen, the average person observing the word reads it, but they're thinking about something else. And if you go, man, I have a hard time reading the Bible, that's okay. That's okay. That's all of us. It takes an approach. You have to think about how to get something out of the word. And so if you would say, man, I just struggle, take heart, I get it. And when I say, set your mind on things of the Spirit, the average response, even from people who love Jesus, would hear that and they're like, that's good. That's really good. What did he say? I don't know. Spirit, flesh, spirit. Yeah. It sounds really good, but let me tell you this. Our problems don't exist at that amperage. When you have stress in your life, a life based on the Spirit, that's not how you hear your problems. Your problems speak to you through a megaphone, don't they? Right about the time you're falling asleep, middle of the night, when you surface, your problems are right there, and they're not going, hey, we might want to take a look at the finances this week. Am I alone? I thought, yeah. My kid said, what? At school? He did, not my kid. Yeah, your kid. The teachers don't call you from school and go, hey, little Johnny punched a classmate. Oh. So when you try to hear the word in this angelic tone, which we think we're supposed to read the Bible, okay, but your problems come and go, hey, listen, we need something we need solutions now. Am I alone? We need something now. Something's got to, now. What about this? My spouse and I don't speak the same language anymore. Nobody wants to. They're like, look this. We're good. No, we're good. We're good. We're in church. We're good. We didn't fight on the way in here. We didn't fight all week long. I didn't get out and walk home this week. What about this one? Out of nowhere, I'm becoming my parents. Oh, that one you'll admit to? I had a talk with somebody I dearly love this week, and he said, I walked by the mirror, and my dad jumped out at me. Young people, how about this one? I've finally reached the age where birthdays are not fun anymore because they remind me how far I haven't made it in life. See, Pastor Jordan made me know a little bit more about the real world than we thought. We thought he just lived in his cathedral up there. These are like problems announce themselves through a microphone, and sometimes we read the word, and the word whispers, and the world screams. And so when these times are going on, and Paul says, set your mind on things of the Spirit, don't beat yourself up if your reaction is like, that. Okay, got it. I got real problems. And I get what you're saying, but today I need a real solution. It feels like there's a disconnect between a spiritual solution and a real world problem. And I think this is why we have seen people leave the church in their young age, is there's never been a connection. Actually, this church specifically does pretty well, but the church at large, I think we don't realize how smart our 12 and 13-year-olds are. We don't realize how smart the teenagers are, and so we're kind of throwing them underhanded softballs, and they're going like, this doesn't solve my problems. You know what else is hard, young people, if you don't know this? Aging is hard. And so you might think you're the only one that's struggling with this change of life, but your parents might be going through the exact same problem, and they've done their process as many times as you've done yours. Zero. There's no experience. There is no blueprint for how to get older than you wanted to ever get. So when we look around the room and there's old people and young people, here's what I hope we realize is like, I've never become a teenager. I've never gotten old. I'm going to tell you a story, and you're just going to have to believe me. I'm not telling it for sympathy's sake, but you're just going to have to hear me, and you guys probably already know all this. There was a season in my life when I couldn't hardly physically get out of bed. Not saying this for sympathy, you already know, but my hips were shot. They were toast. They just didn't work anymore, and I had tried really, really hard to just work through it, and what I had done in trying to work through the pain is I had just decimated my hips. It hurt to wake up. I would wake up in the middle of the night. If you've never had hip pain, talk about us older folks, right? If you've never had hip pain, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and it felt like I just had a sword stuck through the middle of my hips. Like it hurt. And hips are not like a cool injury. Like if you have a blown out knee, people are like, oh, skier, extreme sports. When it's hips, people are like, my grandma did that. I couldn't stand for too long. I couldn't sit for too long. And so I tore my labrum. And the problem with a torn labrum is that it doesn't get a lot of blood supply, and so it won't heal back. And so they say, my hips did lie. And they said I was 100. It hurt to live. Everything hurt. So I go to the number one hip surgeon. This is right about the time church is starting. I go to the number one hip surgeon in Nashville, and they're like, yeah, it's not good, but we can't do a hip replacement because you're too young. So I was like, score. So what do we do? And they're like, well, they went in to do what was supposed to be like a 45-minute surgery, and it took them like 6 hours. They're like, we fixed the labrum, but, that won't heal again. It had to be surgically fixed. It wasn't a waste of time, but honestly, it's just kind of a wreck. So my life, physically, my physical life is kind of this hopeless situation of like, it's bad, and for some reason, it's just not getting better. And then I tore my labrum again a year later. And that's one, remember they said it wouldn't heal unless you had surgery. So some friends of mine, Waylon, I don't know if you guys know Miss Waylon from Alfalfa, she said, I've got a lady, would you please just let her take a look at it? And I'm going to be honest, when they were telling me what she did, I was like, oh, I'm not a hippie. I want like surgery and drugs. I want a knife and a pill. They're like, I promise she can help. You're like, what is this? I promise, it's a good sermon. This is a really good sermon. Wait till you see how this all comes back together. But I'm like, I went to the number one hip surgeon in the nation. I'm just being honest. And I'm like, I don't hold this position now. I'm tattling on myself. But there was a moment where I was like, what's a lady in a little room in Alfalfa going to do? My wife's like, you need to go. And I almost didn't ever go back. I went once, and we had this discussion, and I almost didn't go back, and here's why. She said this. I'm young. It was 10 years ago. She said, your number one problem isn't your hips. I'm like, oh, here we go. Is it my chakra? She said, your number one problem is not your hips. The number one problem is your thinking. And I was like, what? What? She said, you're misunderstanding why your hips are damaged. And because you misunderstand why they hurt, you are leaning further into the things that are causing them to hurt. I'm like, okay. And I left, and here's the problem. I didn't know if she was right or wrong. I'm thinking wrong about my pain because I think my pain hurts. Went to Nashville. He didn't say anything about my thinking. He said I was too young. And And listen, here's the crazy thing. It's 10 years later, and this is the first time that I'm like, I'm so glad I went through that. Because what I went through physically is such a demonstration of what we go through spiritually. What I was going through physically now makes sense at a spiritual level. I went through it at a physical level so that I could later teach about it at a spiritual level. Because what I know is this. There's a lot of busted up spiritual hips out there. People just going through life and going through the pain. And so when somebody comes in and they go, hey, you're thinking about that wrong. You're like, you don't understand my problem if you think I have a thinking problem. And I, the most hypocritical amongst us, go, I get how you feel that way. I wanted surgery, I wanted drugs, I wanted a knife, I wanted a new hip, I wanted fixed. I want now. I don't want to talk about the theory of my pain. I just want my pain to go away because it hurts really badly. And I'm a pretty tough guy. I'm probably not the toughest guy that you know. But, like, I know some tough people, and I'm probably, like, the least tough person. Like, I'm somewhere on the scale. But I didn't even want to get out of bed. It hurt to do everything. It hurt to sit still. It hurt to move. When the Bible challenges the way that we think, it is the most natural reaction for the average observer to go, that sounds good, but I got real problems in my life. I've got real pain in my life. And because I don't understand my pain, I feel like a victim of my circumstances. My circumstances are bad. It's my parents' problem. It's my work problem. It's a problem with my gender. It's a problem with my race. It's a problem with my politics. I'm just the victim. I can't do anything. A victim is someone who has no control over the life that they live in. And so when the Bible comes in and Paul goes, hey, you need to reestablish the way that you think, it is so easy to go, that sounds really good for you church people, but I got real problems. My spouse is actually crazy. My kids are actual psychopaths. It is so easy to, at a glance, dismiss, and I know it because I've been through it at a physical level. I went through it at a physical level where I wanted to dismiss something because it didn't fit the way that I wanted to treat my problems. I just wanted the pain to go away. I wasn't ready to address the source of why the pain was there in the first place. So if you want to reject Jesus and reject the Bible and call it, religion, no one gets that more than I do. Because when I walked away from Jesus, what I walked away from was the pain that I was finding in a church setting. I've got 3 points, one big one and 2 little ones. So it's like if you add them all up, I have 1.3 points in the sermon. What you think. Now listen, I don't think there's anything more important when you walk in the room here or when you turn on a device or when you share the stuff that you've shared because you so kindly did that because I so kindly insisted. Nothing is more important at Shiloh than the way that we think. Period. Nothing will ever outweigh the elements that address the way that we think. Now listen, I grew up in the rodeo culture. When I wasn't at a rodeo, I was at a horse race track. That was my childhood. And when we weren't there, I joked that I had a drug problem. I got drugged at every church that my dad was preaching at. I was not raised in what you would consider a traditionally intellectual environment. A friend of mine joked that I was like, I'm an intellectual orphan. But what I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years in my life is that when I'm able to address the way that I think shapes everything that I do. And if you're from a culture of people who put a high priority on doing and a low priority on thinking, the problem is they begin to do and do and do and do, and nothing ever changes till eventually you think nothing can ever change. Nothing that we do will ever outrank the way that we think or the way that we process. So here's my first point. What we think will be shaped by how we think. There's a giant distinction. It may not seem like it, but young people especially, can I just plead to the young people watching, how you choose to think will form and it will shape what you think. This was my question. I was leaving. I was driving back from Alfalfa. I still remember. Could the way that I think about an injury actually make a difference? I mean, conventional wisdom, Western medicine is like, no. Call Pfizer. Get Pfizer on the phone. I need some solutions. Could the way that I think actually have an effect on a physical injury? And I think that's the question. It's like when we stand up here and we go, I really want you to consider Jesus, people go, could the way that I think about Jesus actually have an effect on my real world problems? Is there a connection between the physical and the ethereal? Is there a connection there? It was a complicated question, and it changed the course of my life. My life is forever changed because of that drive home and my consideration. I want to share it with you. Here's what I'm saying. Not one person listening, whether you're online, whether you're in person, this is why it's important. Because every single person that hears this could choose to benefit. Will they? I have no idea. I don't know what you're going to do with it. I hope you'll consider what I'm saying. And I hope that it will do for you in your life, in your legacy, and in your family, and for generations to come. I hope that today is a turning point in your life in the same way that it was for me. I'm finally now to a way that I can explain it, and it took me 10 years. Romans 8:5-6, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Paul is saying you can't decide what to think. You can't decide what you think. Listen, I know that I was raised in this culture. This is home. You got to understand, this is home for me. And so I'm suggesting that you have control over what you think and how you think, and that there's an important connection there. I know the natural pushback. So if you're feeling it, please know I went through it too. But Paul's saying you can't decide what to think until you have settled on how to think. Do we see the distinction? Because what we think will be the direct result of how we choose to think. See, it's always been the opposite. To me, in my life, we have always been people who decide what to think based on what's happening or what we're seeing. We choose how to think based on what we think. We see, we think, and then we choose how to think about it. It's backwards. We have a long generational history of processing that backwards. Because Paul is saying, once you choose how to think, you will begin to think differently. He doesn't say people who naturally think on spiritual things are at an advantage. See, that's the problem. Karl Marx said this. The knee jerk is that we look around and we make a decision. If that's your process, please understand that's normal. Karl Marx said that religion is the opium of the people. It allows them to look at their suffering and choose to accept it. And as crazy as that might sound for me to say this, I actually get what Karl Marx was trying to say. He was looking around and he was making a choice based on what he was seeing. You guys think I don't understand this culture? We got a fire alarm chirping at us. If that's not home base, that was my whole life growing up. I feel like I'm home right now. For you guys that are online, you just have to take my word for it. Karl Marx said, he set his mind on what he saw in the world, and what he said was, until everyone has an equality of outcome, the world is unfair and it needs addressed. Everybody should have the same thing. Everybody should have the same outcome. And if you're disadvantaged, if you're someone who is disadvantaged and you choose to accept that, that's religion playing a trick on you. Paul is not saying that if you naturally think of things spiritually that you're at an advantage. He says you choose where you want to focus. The assumption that the equal advantage of outcome is the ultimate good in life. See, and I think that if we were to really stop and like, okay, men, I'm going to pick on you because women don't, I would not dare. Men, I'm going to pick on you, and then everybody else can just listen. If you want to know how disciplined you are in your thinking, you can do this little trick. How disciplined am I? How disciplined am I in my thinking? You take about this much of your hand and you reach down and you go, well, that's about how disciplined I am physically. See why I wouldn't include women in this? Sometimes what we realize is I need a new discipline here, but it doesn't happen overnight. I think sometimes we go to the gym one time and we go, that's a good workout. Didn't work. Listen, I'm just living my life. I'm just happy, okay? Sorry, I'm not a 10. Paul is saying that when you begin to exercise here, it might take a little while. It may not happen overnight, but the results are worth it. I'm going to keep going. I don't want to preach all day. Paul is writing exactly to that point years earlier. He said, for to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is choosing life and peace. Paul is saying, choose your processor. Choose your processor. And when you choose your processor, it will determine the outcome. See, we've always been taught, view the outcome and decide how to think about it. Look at your bank account. How do you feel? Look at your kids. How do you feel? Look at your marriage. How do you feel? Why do you think marriages are failing at a rate right now? It's because we look at the marriage, it's not what we want, and then we try to decide how to think about it. Listen, if you've been through a divorce, that's not me picking on you. It's saying, like, you of all people would know, like, yeah, this doesn't feel right. Something about a marriage not working, even when it's not your fault, because I know people in this church, they've been through terrible marriages that if honestly, like from the outside looking in, I don't know what they could have done different. So it's not that. It's just the knowledge, like, this doesn't feel right. We have been through failures that we go, this doesn't feel right. This feels like death. This feels like I'm bringing death to my relationships. Anybody ever been here? I feel like that I'm bringing death to my relationships. I'm bringing death to my work. I'm bringing death to my own habits. My eating habits are bad. I'm on the verge of addiction. Like, this doesn't feel right. And Paul is saying that's the problem, is that when you view the outcome and determine how to think about it, it leads to death. You're a victim of your surroundings. You are a victim of your surroundings. And you want to know what that includes? My surroundings are so good. Why am I not happy? Paul is suggesting that you get to choose what you think. So let me tell you how this works. How you think, how we think, if we think of Shiloh Ranch, and this is a terrible description, I said I wasn't going to say it, but it makes so much sense in my head, maybe it will for you. If Shiloh Ranch turns into a thought garden, that ultimately we come in here and we analyze or we examine how we think, and does the way that we think line up with what the word says? What I believe is your family is going to benefit from it, your work is going to benefit it, you're going to benefit from your work, your legacy begins to change. T.D. Jakes said this, and I thought it was such a good point. I was kind of already about halfway through this sermon, and I listened to a podcast with T.D. Jakes, and he said this: the clothes that you're wearing, everybody in here is wearing something, thank God. Remember, it covers our proof of lack of discipline. Before the clothes that you're wearing became clothes, where were they born? It was a thought. And from the thought, it bounces around until eventually the thought becomes action and becomes labor, and maybe the labor changes how we think about it. But everything that we do in our life doesn't start with action, it starts with everything you're ever going to do for the future of your life, for the rest of your life, it's going to start as a thought. How important is the way that we think? If all that we ever do is examine our thinking to make sure it lines up with the word, every element of our life benefits from it. You are going to be better off for learning how. Now listen, you're going to tell me what to think. I don't even want to. If you know me at all, I'm like an absentee father by nature. You guys will figure it out. My grandpa, you know what his advice used to be? It didn't matter what you were doing. You know what my grandpa's advice was? You'll figure it out. Okay. All right. Feels like this horse is going to buck. You'll figure it out. What'd you figure out? He bucked. Let me tell you the scariest thing that I'm going to say all morning. Boy, this is what I hope anybody that's listening hears. This is the point. She was right about my hips. She was right. I thought, just going strictly scientific for a second, I thought that the sockets were too narrow. When I would walk, it felt like that my femur was crammed in too much. And I was trying to think of accidents that I've been through. What would have caused that? I mean, it just, every time I walked, it hurt. And she said this: they're not too far in. And every time that you walk and you're trying to expand them further out, like just naturally trying to move away from the pain, you're making it worse because the ball of your hip is too far out on the edges of your pelvis. That's what's causing your pain. And I'm like, well, that's the opposite of what I thought. She said the way that you thought about your pain was affecting the way that you walk. We're getting real close to a mic drop moment here. And the way that you walk is causing the pain to increase. And if I would have gone to Nashville and they would have done the surgery that I wanted, which was make it better, quit my job. I want a divorce. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going into debt. All these things that we do to try to make the pain better right now because we don't think about what's causing the pain. If they would have done a hip replacement, my femurs were so out of alignment, they would have made my problems what? Permanent. Permanent. Because the way that I walked was negatively affecting the alignment of my body because I didn't understand why my hips hurt. I just knew that my hips hurt. I've resented that my whole life. Like, my hips, and then I'm standing in front of people going, oh my gosh, wait, I can explain this in a way that I know will make sense. Now, you get to decide what you want to do with it, but let me tell you, it is possible that because you misunderstand your pain, it is affecting your walk, and it is throwing off your alignment. It doesn't just happen physically. Here's my second point, my little miniature point. It's a 3-point sermon, technically. Seminary, come at me. When Paul says, for to set the mind on the flesh is death, what he's saying is if you try to set your thinking according to everything that you see, it's too spread out. To try to think about everything is literally to think about nothing. This is Paul going, you've got limitations on what you can consider. You can't consider everything. It's a survival mechanism. If you drive down the road and you see a road sign and you don't see a road sign, you see the bolts and the metal and the process. Hey, you're 15 signs down before you even are done thinking about the first sign. You see what I'm saying? Like at some point, your brain has to kind of narrow a little bit. And Paul is saying there is a death that comes with trying to consider everything. It's a shortcut. Paul is saying like, hey, when you set your mind on everything that you see, when you try to process based on what you are seeing, it's death. There's a death in that. Oof. The suicide rates in this country right now are not a reflection of the circumstances. It's a reflection of living life with so much pain and so much dysfunction and so much misunderstanding about what's causing the pain. I'm going to tell you what, if I would have had to live with that level of pain the rest of my life, it would have affected me in a very negative way. I was so desperate to just not hurt. And listen, if you're here, nobody wants to admit it. We're all tough. I get it. Nobody's going to be like, that's me. I'm tired of hurting. But it doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean there are not hurting people that go, I'm so tired of hurting and I can't understand what's causing it. Third point. Told you it was short. Here's the third point. The scope needs to narrow if we're going to find focus. Because I think that's probably part of what's killing us is we don't know what's important. We don't know what's important to think about. We're suffering under the tyranny of urgency. Whatever is the most urgent gets our focus. And Paul's going, that's just death. That's a death way to live. You don't improve until you know what to ignore. I mean, I know that doesn't sound real like deep and spiritual, but you don't know what's important until you know what to ignore. Hebrews 13:5 says this. I love the sister verses. It says this. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. No one wants that. We're Americans. We want more money. We don't love it. We don't love it. We just want more of it. There's nobody. Greed in the U.S. doesn't even get called greed anymore. It just gets called ambition. You know, there's things that hide spiritually in our lives. And when you see somebody that's completely free from the draw of money, there's something so frustrating because you're like, why are you so happy? Ugh. And like, it doesn't feel like advice when someone's like, I'm not happy. They're like, you should want less. Oh, I bet. Why? Because we haven't addressed how we process information. We don't think about the way that we think. We never question the way that we think. We always think the way that we think is the right way or we wouldn't think it. Everybody stick with me there? Don't worry about it. And you're like, how do I not worry about that? And he gives you this verse right here. It says, God says, hey, you're thinking about everything. You're thinking about things according to the flesh. You're dying on the inside. It's affecting the way that you walk. You're giving up power in your life because you're walking according to this and then according to that. It's like you're trying to live every single life all at the same time. You've got no simplicity. And because you have no simplicity, everything's spread out so thin. So that even when you get money, see if this doesn't make sense. Even when you get money, you spend it to go further into debt. Be content with what you have, he said. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. What? When was the last time you really stopped and processed all of your information through, well, I know that God's not going to leave me or forsake me. How would that change what we process? At the end of the day, I may lose everything except God's loyalty to me that I didn't create. God's not loyal to you because you're so amazing. Chances are, you probably already know. You know my biggest frustration with myself? I'm not as amazing as I wish I was. I swear. That's my biggest frustration. Man, I wish I was cooler. You know what gets on my nerves? Super talented people, because I'm like, ugh. I'm not jealous. I'm frustrated with myself that I'm not more amazing. And so this thought that somehow God is loyal to me because I earned it is laughable, even amongst the people I know. God goes, I chose you. Like, I'm in. I'm in. What do you think the cross was about? I'm in. And like, well, all the things I'm worrying about, most of the things that I worry and that I stress and that I spend money on and that I fight about and that I'm in a bad mood about, most of those things come from forgetting that God has already declared his loyalty to me. That's what it means to set your mind according to the Spirit. Now, if you're from the outside the church model and you're looking in, you're like, I don't know if I believe that. Totally fine. This isn't a here's what to think. I'm not saying here's what to think. I'm just wanting everyone to be clear. This is how we desire to think. Because when we choose to focus on the things that are important, life gets better. Now listen, this is it. I can see the word communion in my notes. You know we're getting to the bottom. Any athlete that's done anything athletic, any kind of endeavor, will tell you this. Physically, your power comes from your hips. Now, I know that I'm taking two analogies and I'm just comparing them, and I'm not trying to make it more shallow. I lived through this, and so it's meaningful to me. Hopefully, it's at least understandable to you. Your power exists in your hips. When she started to explain to me why my hips hurt, my pain started to make more sense. At 33 years old, I was 33 years old when I finally got through this process. I started to change the way that I walked. I used to walk on the outsides of my feet. Why? Because for some reason, that was the closest thing to out of pain I could find. Church, please, I'm begging, try to hear what I'm saying, because this is a life-changing concept if we can get it. I had to start leaning into things that were painful. I had to change the way that I walked. I had to be more disciplined in my daily procedures. I had to look for ways in my day to change my walk, because as I began to change my walk, my body started to realign. And as I started to realign, guess what happened? It didn't happen right away. In fact, it got worse. Like, do we not? I mean, sometimes the simplicity leads to more pain. Sometimes it means you have to go to your wife and apologize. Sometimes it means you have to look honestly at yourself and go, am I causing issues in my kid's life by being so busy and so distracted that it's showing up at school, but really maybe there's some of my own life that I need. I'm going through this right now. Like, my kids are fine, but like, I'm going through this as a pastor. Are there things in my life that I've allowed to be a distraction that are going to harm the life of my children? I mean, this is what I mean. Like, Jordan, I'm going through a change of life right now where I'm having to realign my walk a little bit, and I've already gone through it physically. It's just as hard to go through it spiritually. My shoe size, I know this sounds crazy. There's truth in what I'm about to say. You're going to have to decide what to do with it. If I forget communion, somebody give me the... my whole life, I'd wear a size 10.5 or size 11 shoe. Like, I'm almost 6'4". I'm 6'3" and then some. I'm a big guy, and I was like, just what I thought it was. When I began to walk, and I'm using this as a demonstration of my foot. I'm not sure if the camera can see this. I was always walking on the outside of my foot. My toes always pointed in. But as I began to walk on the bottoms of my feet, what I found was that my feet, actually, my whole life, what was true about myself was different than what I thought. I wear a size 13 shoe now. Like, you were 33, you discovered you were a size 13 when you were 30. There were things about my life that were true the whole time physically, that because of how I walked in my daily life, I wasn't discovering. And let me tell you something. I would go through it 100 times more if what we can do here at Shiloh, if what we accomplish collectively, this is why when people go, is it live or is it digital? I'm like, can we please rethink that? Can we please try to rethink this? Because there is a world of people looking at a screen right now going, my life is in pain. And let me tell you, guys, women, you'll know this is true, but guys, we don't talk about it. We're not going to walk in and be like, I need to tell you something. I'm hurting. But if you look at our habits will tell you more about our life than our words, because our habits, a lot of times, we're just trying to anesthetize pain that we don't understand. There's a generation of people who considered what the church had to say, and they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. I can't get there. And my plea is, could we just reconsider the possibility? Could you go back and just reconsider that maybe the way that we're walking is surrendering a lot of power in our lives? That exactly what Paul was teaching was like, hey, you're surrendering a lot of power by trying to do everything, by trying to cover too much territory. Maybe just take a deep breath and just do the things that God is asking you to do and see if life doesn't sort of return back to alignment. Because otherwise, what happens is this. We go through a surgery of sorts. We quit a marriage. We quit a job. We cut off people. We spend money. And we create permanent damage because we wouldn't reconsider that it was maybe the way that we were thinking. We're going to go into communion. If you're online, feel free to jump in, but here's how it's going to look here. What does communion say? What did Jesus say? He goes, we're going to do communion, and I want you to think. I want you to think that communion is a representation of exactly what Hebrews says, like, hey, I chose you. You'll only fall so far. I heard Randall Wallace say this. He said such a beautiful quote. He said that he used to think of his life, see if this doesn't make sense. He used to think of his life as hanging to this rope over a black abyss. And he's just hanging, and life was always a struggle just to survive and get through another day. And he said he got to a point in his life where he was so tired, he was so exhausted, he was so done, he just couldn't hold on any longer. He didn't know what the black abyss held, but he knew that his struggle and his chaos and his desperation, he couldn't do anymore. And he said, what I discovered was God is what I fell into when I let go of the thing I was clinging to. I just wonder if there's just somebody that needs to hear that. That there is a God willing to catch us in those moments, not when we walk in and we're like, dear Father. I honestly think we might give God the giggles in those moments. God's like, oh, you're so boring. I'm talking about the guys like, I can't hold on any longer. God's like, let go. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. At very least, what you're going to fall into is a deeper understanding of what I have. And what you'll find is when you get there, there's rest. It just feels so good not to be clingy anymore. It will change the way that you walk. That's why we do communion. That's why communion is important. It's that deep, soulful reminder is that this is not what we did. This is not what we did. This is a response to what he did. Let me pray. Lord, I feel like there are 10,000 sermons that could be mined out of just that thought. Lord, if we could reestablish the way that we think, if we could reshape or reclaim, let's say reclaim the way that we think. Lord, that we stop processing information based on what we see, but God, we start processing and only then do we start to see what you see. God, if our thinking doesn't change, our walk doesn't change. And if our walk doesn't change, Lord, we are so out of alignment. We're just so by default out of alignment. As bizarre as it was to me to think that my injuries were more related to my thinking, I know spiritually it's just as hard. And I know that there's got to be people who hear this and go, it sounds good, but just sort of on the fence about whether it would work, whether that's possible, whether the way that we think works. And God, I just pray for a warmth that only you can achieve, only you can do, to come in and be God in our lives in a way that only you can be. A comfort that we haven't felt in our own processes. God, as we get ready to take communion and go into a time of worship, God, put your sacrifice back at the front of our minds. Cause us to think about that in our moments of stress, in our moments of panic, in the moments of misalignment. Just speaking, and I know I've talked a lot to the guys today, but just in our moments of misalignment where life just doesn't make sense, God, bring us back to you'll never leave us, you'll never forsake us. There is no risk in which we fall out of the hands of God. Lord, help us to lean further into who you are and further away from what we naturally think of ourselves. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.